Hi, I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States.
And this is Gender, a Wider Lens, a podcast dedicated to the shifting concepts around gender in our contemporary culture.
Through in-depth interviews, personal stories, and psychological exploration, we seek to open up the discourse around this hot-button issue.
Join us as we look at gender from a wider lens. How's it going, Sasha? How's life?
It's going well. We have a solo episode today, which is nice. We have not sat down one-on-one and chatted for quite some time, so it's nice to see you and talk with you.
I know. Every time we have a solo episode, we just think, oh my God, that was brilliant. We really like chatting psychology.
Yeah, we do. What's going on in your world, Stella? You're obviously in a new room. We know that.
Yeah. So many people have told me sort out your background, and I'm like, okay. I'll sort out my background. So this isn't me sorting out my background. I've moved rooms, and then I'm going to try and make the background nice. We'll see. This is my kids' games room, so they look a little bit shocked, like what the hell is going on? But I think it's all for the good, for the family.
Mom is taking over the game room for now.
yeah. Just for these Zooms, I'll see how it goes. It's a nice view out the window, so that's pleasant.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to check that out. Check out my new need a plant. Everybody tells me I need a plant.
Yeah, I have I have a plant that's hanging back there behind me. And I have some plants here, but you can't see them.
It's funny because I think our backgrounds are actually very reflective of us. Do you follow me? Yours is very organised and clean and tidy and very you, and mine is chaotic and always somewhere different and always kind of slightly higgledy-piggledy. So I think it's kind of very true to life.
You had a comment about this. Someone mentioned something about this to you.
Somebody said to me, they were obviously listening to the podcast, and I said, oh, sure, me and Sasha are so different. And she looked at me as if, really? And I was like, oh my God, chalk and cheese. And she looked at me as if to say, really? And I was like, oh my God, we're so different. And then I paused and I thought, well, like, we're very aligned psychologically, unbelievably, for two people who've come from almost two different generations, backgrounds, everything about our lives are different. And everything about how we live is completely different. And yet psychologically, we just seem like we do seem to land very similar places very often without even noticing.
Yes, totally. It's very interesting. And that's something that really becomes more obvious when we spend time together in person too, right? Like the times when we've been together for in-person events or for when we took holiday together, you just realize, wow, our day-to-day like lives and routines are very different. And it's so funny that you say that. Like, I'm always in the exact same place when we record these episodes. Yeah. And you're like, I'm at a hotel in this place, and I'm at my mom's house, and I'm at so-and-so place. So that is a little, like, kind of indicator of how differently we live.
Is. Yeah. Oh, it's very reflective. And as well as that, I think you're an organizer. And I'm a disorganizer. I don't know what I am, but I'm definitely not an organizer anyway. And you're scheduled, and I get tense if I'm overscheduled. Well, you get tense if you're underscheduled. It's a complete different response to being like if my timetable is too busy, my heart starts beating. I'm like, I need some blank spaces here.
It's
and you
so
don't have that at all.
Well, I think something that I really admire about you that I'm not always so good at is I tend to get really focused on like the details that are right in front of me. And something I've seen from you, which I really would love to learn from, like just looking at how you do GenSpect, you have huge vision. And so you tend to think about the big moves. And I tend to think about like small details. And honestly, in the podcast, I think those visions complement each other because like you need a little bit of both. But I think that's something that's very, very different about us. I tend to be, a little bit, I can get blinders on a little bit when it comes to like task accomplishments and like things like that. But our daily lives are quite different too, I think.
Hilariously different. And I'd imagine our partners are chalk and cheese, completely different.
So wait, what is chalk and cheese? You said that twice.
Well, completely different, like as different
Am
as
I
chalk,
chalk
and
or
cheese.
cheese?
I speak English. You're. Let me think. You're chalk. I'm cheese.
Why is that?
I was imagining me as a big fat cheese.
And I'm just like a
Yeah.
dried chalk. That's
No,
nice.
I was thinking creative, artistic.
Oh, that's interesting.
I remember you once saying that there was designers in your family, and I've thought, yes, I can see that
Yeah.
in you.
Yeah.
That
Everybody
there's
in my
something visual in
family
you.
is a visual artist, designer. My fiance is an architect. Like the visual orientation and like this, the state of your living environment has always been really important in my family. So like the aesthetics of it, the mise en place kind of thing. Like I'm sure you've heard that term.
No,
Mise en place is that the idea that comes from professional cuisine and cooking, that everything has a place where it belongs and life is
wow.
easier and processes are facilitated better when you know exactly where things are going to be that you need at the time. So it comes from like a chef in the kitchen has to work incredibly quickly and he doesn't even have to look. He knows that the chopped parsley, for example, is like to the left
Wow.
by 3 inches from his hand, So that's what mise en place means, that everything has its place. It comes from French. So for me, like the visual environment and the actual physical environment has always been really emphasized in my family. So that's something interesting. As a kid, I used to go over to friends' houses, and if their friends' parents weren't incredibly anal about tidiness and organization, I was like, wow, this is real freedom. You guys really know how to live your lives. We have to clean everything every single weekend and everything has to be perfect. And if the bed is not made, you're considered like a horrible slob. Like it was very
Well, that's so
intense.
funny because I come from like the messiest house in the world, and I used to go over to people's houses when I was a kid going, wow, just look at this. You just pick it up and you put it in the place and it all fits and you're not jamming it in and trying to get broken things out of the way and kind of wrestle through a mess to get to the plate and stuff like that. So I had the complete opposite. Yeah, just kind of like, it was like almost a window into the future when I'd go into other kids, like, wow, this is a way to live.
I love that. The future is not female. The future is tidy.
Yeah. I'm still not quite, as you can see from the background, I'm not quite there.
It looks pretty tidy. Your bookshelf is very organized. Looks organized to me.
Ish. But I'm a good deal tidier now, I'd say, than the family I came from. They were all mad. But I remember there was one of us in a family of four kids, and one of my brothers was vaguely tidy, and my mother's reaction was like, he should join the military. Like, and I was like, he's so slightly tidy, and that was our crazy reaction. So how's your Subscribe Star these days?
It's going well. So, my Subscribe Star is a place where I make these monthly topic videos based on kind of questions that I get or things that are on my mind. And I do live Q&As. And I kind of have a couple of really interesting things. I've been thinking a lot about resilience. Like you and I have talked a lot about how it's so important for therapy to foster kids' resilience. Wow. And we see that resilience is being undermined in a lot of different ways, which of course we'll talk about in today's episode. But I did a recent video about resilient outcomes. And what does the science say about this? Have you heard of George Bonanno? He's a researcher who wrote the book, The End of Trauma. And it's basically about the science of trauma and what actually happens. And it's kind of like, I thought it was going to be more of like a critique of trauma-informed therapy or something like that. But actually, it's a very optimistic deep dive into when people are resilient in the face of trauma. What are some of the things that we can learn about that process, or what are they doing differently? And so he talks about kind of the way people assess their current and immediate needs. They figure out what tools and resources they have, and they keep evaluating, okay, like, what do I need to do next? What can I do to manage this situation? Okay, next week, what do I do to manage this situation? And he kind of talks about these processes and So I talk about that book, and I talk about another study where researchers find that a person's attitudes about stress can impact how the stress impacts them. So like if
Oh,
you
really?
believe that stress is debilitating and it's bad for your health, it can actually have a physiological reaction in how you do encounter stress versus people who believe that stress is kind of good for you. Stress helps you think quickly under pressure. Those people can have different physiological and psychological reactions to stress. So I talked a little bit about that and what we can learn about gender.
It occurs to me that maybe some of us do. I think I do thrive a little bit from stress. I know I'm brighter, I'm cleverer under stress.
Yeah.
And when I'm not under stress, my brain goes a bit slower. You know what I mean? I can definitely. But I wonder, do some people, or is it just that they believe they do, and therefore they rise to the occasion? It's interesting.
Well, it seems that your beliefs about it have a lot of impact on it. I mean, generally speaking, it is true that stress does kind of arouse our physiology to think quicker and act. So that's, I think, a kind of a universal. But what happens kind of in response to the stress, or how we understand that stress, is really important in kind of the long term. So it's very interesting research. And I have a couple of clips up on YouTube so people can watch that. And then if they want to check out more, they can. But, it's just been on my mind a lot because you and I talk a lot about this. And we, of course, read Abigail Schreier recently, and just thinking about, and of course, Jonathan Haidt, who wrote a book about the anxious generation. So, and I know you're reading and reviewing it. I think
I've read it. I've read it and reviewed it. We'll talk about it a little in this episode because it's combined with Abigail's book, Bad Therapy, Abigail Schreier, and then John Haidt, The Anxious Generation. It's a pretty frightening, pretty negative vista, and yet we're psychotherapists, so we are going to see the harder side of life. We are going to see the anxious generation more than other people. And I think they've really nailed it between the two of them. I really do.
Yeah. What's going on with you and your Substack?
Oh, yeah, it's funny, isn't it? An interesting, now that we've got the podcast on Substack, which is great, and it feels like, and you're on Substack, so we're all on Substack now, so it's a kind of a gang of us, and Jen Specht is going on Substack. There's a lot of conversation about that. Yeah, it's going to be a big deal. Lots of plans around different regions. So there might be, there'll be Australia, there'll be New Zealand, Australia, America, different regions, you know what I mean, on the Substack. So that's going to be very exciting. And for my own Substack, and I've been kind of looking at videos and stuff like that, kind of looking over at YouTube, thinking maybe I should kind of put some effort into the YouTube kind of situation, because in a way, no more than yourself, do you find that I've never thought so deeply about different things, and you can have a thought, quite a significant thought, and it can almost come and go if we don't record them. Do you find that?
I have a document that is in my computer, and every time I get one of those kinds of thoughts, I just write it down.
Yeah.
But it's funny because sometimes I come back to it and I can't actually flush it out better. But in the moment, it felt connected to a revelation thoughts. Yeah. So, but you're so right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I felt free with the Substack to kind of on a whim, I'll say, I'm going to do a video about this, and I can. Or I'm going to write a piece about this, and I can. So there's something about that has really freed me up. It's just kind of to get the thoughts down, and then later on you can put it into further, but it's great to catalogue them. So that's my enjoyment. I'm enjoying having a Substack a good deal more than I thought I would. I didn't really think. Yeah, I really enjoy it. Yeah.
Well, it's a great platform, and I'm finding it very enriching. And I'm remembering several weeks back, you talked about the difference between Twitter and Substack. And I don't remember what you called it, something pretty hilarious. I'm sure our listeners will remember. Do you remember this? What did you call Twitter?
I do remember. I do. Yeah.
You said Twitter was like a cocaine bender.
Like a dive bar, yeah.
And I've kind of noticed that too now that I've been on Substack a little bit longer. But the long form pieces there are really nice to read.
There's so much more. There's so much more civilized. I don't know what my analogy was, but I often think something like Facebook is kind of like the town hall or the parish hall, as they say in Ireland, kind of where the old ladies go and have a cup of tea and it's all very sedate. And then Twitter's like this raucous kind of drug-fueled nightclub, while Substack is like a posh hotel where you're everything's very civilized.
I love that, Stella.
Yeah, and GenSpect is just gearing up to release our tickets for Lisbon. That's been a long time coming. I've been kind of slightly dreading kind of the whole, right, let's go, let's operationalize this, because it's a big deal, this conference. It's going to be the same town as WPATH, and we've got some amazing speakers. Lionel Shriver's the big one for me. I think she's a leading thinker of our generation. Like, I really do. She's brilliant on gender, but she's brilliant on manias in general. And she's brilliant. She's an amazing, she looks to the future a lot, to the near future. And I'm very interested in the near future. I'm not really into sci-fi, but I do love things about 10 years ahead. What's going on then? What's going on in 20 years? And of course, we've got, Peter Boghossian, Kathleen Stock, Helen Joyce, Michael Schellenberger, of course, Andrew Doyle, who I loved, Titania and all this. Some amazing, Julie Bindel, some brilliant speakers. So it's going to be.
Can I ask a question about the conference? Because in light of the WPATH files, I mean, I see the WPATH is kind of a sinking ship. And even I didn't read it yet, but I saw a headline about their response to the Cass review being like cis normative or something, which it's no surprise. They have a totally ideological angle. But do you have any predictions or thoughts about the WPATH conference in Lisbon in light of everything that is happening now?
I'm very interested. I'm a kind of organic thinker, so I don't know my thoughts right now about how they're going to respond. But I think you're right about the sinking ship. I think it is a sinking ship, and I think they've had a few serious blows to the head, and they are not the position that they were in. And I think they are feeling increasingly bedraggled. I do think at our two conferences last year, first in Killarney and then in Denver, I think this was an organization, just from the way they spoke, they were feeling on the ropes. They were feeling they weren't being appreciated. And I don't think they should be appreciated. I think they brought in some really reckless policies. And I think they haven't provided a good model of how to provide, good quality healthcare to anybody who's gender questioning. So I think it's had its day. And I think September in Lisbon could be the day that they really realize they've gone into the second division. But we'll see.
Interesting, fascinating. Well, I'm sure our listeners will be eagerly awaiting those tickets, and probably by the time this airs, the tickets will be available. So please go get them.
I'm sure they'll be sold out. Huh?
Yeah.
We hope you're enjoying this conversation as much as we are. We just wanted to take a quick moment and say thank you to all of our listeners. Your support helps us to keep the lights on and the mics hot.
We recently made the switch to Substack so we could build a more robust listener community. Visit widerlenspod.com and check out the different subscription tiers.
For just $8 a month, premium subscribers get access to weekly bonus content, discussion posts, and more.
And founding members get the inside track on who's coming up to the show, with the ability to submit their own questions for our esteemed guests.
For those of you who are in need of parenting support and resources, we each have parent coaching membership groups. Plus, you can buy our book, When Kids Say They're Trans.
And if you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe, and get involved in the lively discourse in the comments section.
Thank you so much. Now, back to the show.
All right, so let's jump into today's episode. I mean, you and I wanted to talk about the over-treatment of young people. And, several months, I can't remember when, we did an episode about the over-emphasis on diagnostic labels and the fixation on, mental health conditions and diagnoses. And I'm almost thinking this is kind of like an extension of that discussion, because in addition to wanting the label, parents, young people, teachers, it seems like all of society has really bought into the idea that mental health intervention is the way we solve lots of societal problems. And we are not so sure about that, to say the least.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this has crept into my mind over the years. And I used to say many years ago, when I was first a psychotherapist, this is so long time ago, and somebody would say, when should you go to therapy? And I used to say, like a little sing-song, like a clown, oh, well, they often say that when you're wondering whether you should go to therapy, well, then you should. And I'm like, no, I'm not. No, I don't agree with myself.
It's very similar to, like, if you think you might be trans,
I
then
know.
you are.
I'm embarrassed to tell you that.
No,
story.
I totally used to feel similarly. Yeah, I get it.
I thought we could all do with it. I thought it was just fundamentally good. What bad could come of it? It's all for the good. And for somebody like me or you who enjoys speaking and thinking psychologically, I can see how we think that. But that doesn't mean other people do. And I think the culture has gone our way. And I think something has gone wrong. I think the overdiagnosis, the overtreatment, the reflexive turn to therapy, which I wrote about a lot in my book, What Your Teen Is Trying to Tell You, where I was trying to kind of position the parents back in to the lives of their teenagers, because I felt they were frightened and pushing it over to the professionals. And the teenager was left without a parent as such. They have the parent in the backup, but really go and sort it out with you. Have you talked to your therapist about this? Bring that to your therapist. Make sure to speak about that. No, they should be speaking to their friends and their mommy and daddy. And so there's this, it's crept into, it's like an attitude that's crept in that I think has been really, really damaging.
Yeah. Why do you think parents have been kind of positioned in a way that this is the most common response? I mean, this is, and I wonder too sometimes if it's a certain demographic of parent, because parents, well, first of all, by definition, anyone who contacts me or contacts you, any parent who contacts us, they are already bought into the idea that professionals can help me with this. And I think especially in this weird landscape of gender, they're reading all of this hyper affirmative stuff. It doesn't really jive with their instincts. And then they read something that you've written or I've written or something we've talked about in the podcast, for example, and they go, these therapists I think are aligned with me, so let me reach out to them. So obviously, I think that's great. And frankly, I have heard back from parents who have felt very supported and helped by conversations we've had. But really what we're doing, and I think your book, What Your Teen Is Trying to Tell You, is a beautiful example of this. What we're often doing is redirecting parents back to their own parental authority. And that is helpful, right? But when I talk to parents, sometimes they are just so desperate. Please help me find a therapist. My kid desperately needs a therapist. And there are lots of reasons why I think that is happening. And some of them are absolutely not the fault of parents at all. But just, why do you think so many parents or a certain type of parent is very willing to treat and treat and treat and overtreat their child? Why do you think that's happening?
I kind of studied this a lot with my first book, Cottonwell Kids, and I've never let it go that, like, really from the 90s onwards, there has been a parenting industry that has quite significantly disempowered parents. And it used to be, this idea that mother knows best. And the mother was really in the center of the family as the presumptive, the parent who could kind of say what was needed. This was certainly in my culture in Ireland. And it was very strong that if the mother said, no, we should do this, or the child needs a nap, or, do you know what I mean? There was a power within being a mother, a presumption that she knew her kids more than anybody else. And it was a respected position. They mightn't have been respected in other places, but certainly around their children, by God, they were. And I think that has been eroded by a parenting industry, which I'm embarrassed to be part of because I've written parenting books, if you follow me, and a mental health industry, which is a whole other thing that I'm part of that I'm becoming increasingly embarrassed about. But that since the 90s, they started doing TV programs that were really helpful about how to raise your kids, how to kind of, super nanny. Do you remember? You mightn't watch.
Yes,
Yeah,
totally.
yeah.
I do. She was
All of
British,
those.
right?
Yeah, and she came
Mm-hmm.
over to America. She was in Britain first, and there was so many of those kind of parenting programs, which I ate up when I had young babies. All the parenting books. There was a few parenting books, like Dr. Spock started in 1950s, and his first sentence of the book, the first sentence of the first baby book, the first parenting book, was in the 1950s, and he said, "Trust yourself because you know more than you think you do." And that was beautiful. That was beautiful.
Yeah.
And that was the attitude back then. Over time, attachment parenting came in and Sears and, you know what I mean, some extraordinarily kind of prescriptive finger waggy parenting books came in saying this is what you do and you put the baby down at 7 p.m. and you know what I mean? It was so strict and so definitive. And I think parents over time presume that professionals know better and that if they don't do what the professionals are saying they do, they're going to, harm their child for life. And that's such a frightening prospect that I did it myself, especially when the babies were young. Just a kind of an absolute kind of, I was terrified for my first year of my first child, terrified about the
Mm-hmm.
things I was going to do wrong. So that lack of confidence, I'm not sure that happened much in previous generations. I think previous generations, they mightn't have had much confidence outside the home, but in the home, they were the mother and they knew what they were doing. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's my read. What do you make of that?
It's so funny. I mean, I agree with everything you're saying, and a thought just came into my mind about kind of personality types, for
Oh,
parents.
yeah.
And I'm imagining that there's a kind of spectrum, as there are with many traits, right? Personality traits. And on one end, there's maybe the trait of being very uncertain about your own abilities as a mother or as a parent, right? So you
Yeah.
might be particularly apt to kind of seeking out other advice, reading tons of parenting
Yeah.
books, deferring to experts. And on the other side of the spectrum
Uh-huh.
is an overconfident, perhaps an overconfident parent who maybe, because, the ROGD profiles are varied, but something that I think exists in a small number, like if we looked at the bell curve, most ROGD parents are these resourceful, very intelligent, loving, attached parents. And
Very
on the
engaged.
uns, you have the very, very not confident, like the kind of parent where I talk to them and I'm like, oh my God, I think your child's literally abusing you. Like I've talked to parents like
Yeah.
that. But then
Yeah.
there's the other side where sometimes parents are so overly protective, smothering, intrusive, and those parents, of course, would never listen to the professionals because they know everything. So I'm just wondering about that just as a phenomenon where it's probably helpful to some degree to be open and curious to some kinds of parenting advice and some kinds of psychological information, but not to be so porous that you think you have nothing to offer your children. So I'm just kind of
Wow.
thinking about how it's probably healthy to have a little bit of uncertainty about your parental kind of
Yeah.
involvement. But if you are overly certain, you might be kind of plowing through in a way that is not helpful. I don't know. What do you
Yeah.
make of that?
No, well, I agree because as I was saying all that to you, there was a kind of question in the back of my mind, and I didn't know what it was. And what it was, now that you've said that, it's crystallized, is that there was plenty of tyrannical parents who knew best, but they were awful. They were completely authoritarian, crazy ruled. You know what I mean? It was awful. So while they might have been confident, it wasn't appropriate. But the lack of confidence in parenting is something I come up against a lot. But parents who don't have confidence, and sometimes when we have a lack of confidence, we can do kind of irrational rules, saying, "Okay, that's it. It's I'm going really strong on one thing." It can be very erratic, and I think I do see that a lot. One thing I do want to say though that was I've kind of gone on a journey, for want of a better word, around RGD and gender and parents and children. And it's been, like 2020 was when I first started those parenting groups. And I'll never forget when I first started them. And I was on the
Yeah.
WhatsApp with you and Lisa Marciano. And it was devastating at the time, finding all these parents in all these secret places, and they were living these secret lives, and it was awful, and there was such heartache and such devastation. But even the very first meeting, which I'll never forget, and they went on, the parents were telling me all about their children, and they had a long list of diagnoses. Each child did. So it would be they were diagnosed with autism at 7, and then maybe diagnosed with ADHD at 12, and then maybe gender at 14. Like, it was a litany of diagnoses, and also many therapists in their lives. In their young lives, there was many therapists. And at the time, I was thinking, these are the most vulnerable children in society we're talking about. Now, 4 years in, I wonder, or were they a reflection of a culture that was over-diagnosing and over-treating? You know what I mean? Was actually that part of it? Rather than these are the most vulnerable, these were the children that were most diagnosed and therapized. And that worries me.
Oh my God, that's a huge point, because one of the things that we've thought about and probably talked about a little bit is that sometimes you see that there's a pattern of taking a medicalized approach to all kinds of problems. Maybe because sometimes there's this underlying theme of like, you're a scientific thinker, maybe you're an engineer, maybe you're a physician yourself. And so you have this understandable like belief in scientific strategy for dealing with problems. You're a problem solving kind of person. So if something seems to be distressing to your child or to you, the solution is a scientific one. And part of that might be a medical diagnosis or psychological diagnosis. So I think it's very poignant that you're pointing that out. And I've also heard some, research coming out lately about how, depending on a family's political orientation, how they might be more or less likely to kind of ascribe mental health labels to their child's problems, right? So this has come up in the context of like more liberal parents are doing things like gentle parenting, for example, or not that that's necessarily pathologizing, but it is a way of saying, like, the gentle parenting movement, which Abigail Shrier talks about in her book, is basically this idea that parents should avoid creating consequences for kids and instead just kind of let the kids lead. So it's interesting. It's a bit different from the medical approach, but there's a theme underlying, which is that, I don't actually know what to do with this child. So either I let the child decide, I let a physician decide, I let a therapist decide. So that's very interesting. And these are kids who tend to glorify mental health diagnoses, which we've talked about before. So there might be something to that point. And, you and I have also seen that in a context where the social environment is so hyper affirming, that really undermines the parent's ability to do what their instincts are telling them to do. They lose touch with that because, well, if I don't go along with this, the teacher is, the therapist is, and then you are, as the parent, you are in a position of feeling totally helpless. So I'm sure there are lots of factors that contribute to this relinquishing of authority that a lot of parents feel they have no choice but to do.
Wow. God, that's a really, really good point.
We want to take a moment to thank our sponsors, GenSpect and Therapy First. GenSpect is an international organization committed to fostering a healthy approach to sex and gender. The team and members of GenSpect strive to promote high-quality, evidence-based care for gender nonconforming individuals. GenSpect is pleased to offer a non-medicalized approach to gender with their recently published Gender Framework, and they continue to hold conferences around the world. Visit genspect.org to learn more.
Therapy First is a non-profit worldwide professional association of mental health providers who view psychotherapy as the appropriate first-line treatment for gender dysphoria. Therapy First supports psychotherapists working with gender dysphoric youth and young adults and offers public education on mental health and psychotherapy. Visit therapyfirst.org to learn more.
Now back to the show.
I think that the parents are often fed a line, just like the teenagers, just like every one of us, that we should be happy, if you follow me. And if we're not happy, something's wrong. And it's either society or it's mental illness or something has to be fixed because we're not happy. Now, that is insane. You know what I mean? Life is hard.
Yeah.
And we have moments of happiness, and the more we have, the better. But oh my God, the human condition is filled with angst. You know what I mean? We worry our way through lives. Like, the brain is a problem-solving organ. So the brain at ease seeks out problems, which is how we made great poetry, great music, lovely rooms. You know what I mean? That's how, architecture, whatever, technology.
Mm-hmm.
But because of that, we're not as content as cats or cows or dogs. You know what I mean? We don't sit at ease chewing the cud. We sit at ease and fret and worry and think what we could improve and this should happen. But as a result, it's at a cost of our happiness, our well-being. And it's like this idea has crept in that we should be happy. And it's like, wow, have you met humans? We're filled with angst. We're filled with neurosis.
Yeah.
And this new presumption that if you're not happy, you should get diagnosed or you should get treatment or you should get therapy makes me think, where are we going to be going with this? Is everybody going to end up with antidepressants, which will make us feel good, but there'll be a lot of drawbacks around this? And one thing you notice and you could track as night follows day, somebody who isn't massively distressed, who starts antidepressants, generally starts telling everybody to start them. If you follow me, because life is easier. It's more pleasant. So this is to do with the culture we're in, which feels huge, that yet again our world and gender has almost exposed this culture, that you're not feeling happy during puberty and you've got autism, so therefore there must be something huge wrong, rather than no, this is puberty and autism. That's enough.
Yeah. And it's kind of making me think about, like, I know that this has become a little bit, it got commodified and then watered down, but I think that's why the mindfulness movement felt so powerful a few years ago, because, you know, there were a lot of clinicians and mindfulness practitioners basically saying, of course, you're not going to be super happy all the time, but the point is, try your best to be, quote, in the moment and notice these fluctuations in mood and let them go, not taking everything so seriously as though it's an indicator of something terribly wrong. And I'm thinking about, I started reading this book many years ago. I think it was called Children of Emotionally Immature Parents or something like that, which should tell you absolutely nothing about my life or my experiences.
Oh, yeah.
But anyway.
What do you think of that, Sasha's dad?
I hope my parents aren't listening. Well, the good news is I stopped reading the book, and I'll tell you why. The first page said something along the lines of, if there are things about your life that are difficult, or if there are psychological things you experience that feel wrong, it's because of something your parents did to you in childhood.
Oh,
and it wasn't like a tongue-in-cheek statement. It was like stated like a literal fact.
Oh my God.
And I thought to myself, wow, first of all, this is so insane and such BS. And also, I think this is a message that we all get from our culture. And when I was, a couple of months ago, I was doing some videos around the repressed memories epidemic. And I learned about a really interesting paper by a psychologist, I think called Jo Widowis. And she had a theory about harm narratives. And her theory was that the predominant narrative of the time, she was writing in the 80s and 90s, was, what is wrong with me? And the answer that psychologists had been putting forward was, if something's, quote, wrong with you, it's probably because of a childhood experience. And I mean, this is so ubiquitous in like mental health culture that
Yeah.
if you feel like something is wrong, it could probably be traced back to some sort of childhood experience, not being loved enough, not being nurtured enough, being yelled at by somebody or whatever. So, when I read that in the book, I thought, wow, this is exactly what a lot of superficial therapy culture is telling people.
Oh God.
And in fact, that is absolutely nonsensical. Like, human life is full of tragedy and difficulty and ups and downs and moments of joy and then moments of despair. And that is the normal baseline state. What makes people think that everything and anything negative can be traced back to some sort of terrible thing your parents did? And maybe that idea just emerged from the fact that all of us have imperfect parents, obviously, right?
Exactly. And we will be imperfect parents. And so will our kids be. But I think this is where I get nervy and feel like a priest who's lost his faith, because I look at psychology, and that like kind of flippant line around Freud, if it's not one thing, it's the mother. And this kind of blaming of the mother, if you follow me. And you look
Yeah.
at the birth of psychology and how negative it was towards parenting. And you know what I mean? And it continued. And I think, almost like, I often think that, feminism loses track of the human nature. I think psychology also loses track of human nature, as in, we're just humans. The parents, of course, did they damage the child, or did life damage the child? Because inevitably life damaged the child, because life is so unfair, as opposed to the parents damage the child. All this kind of sticking it to the parents. Now that I'm a parent myself, I'm much more forgiving. But I just think, I think that it's almost climaxed in these last couple of decades. You know what I mean? Of this, like,
Yeah.
vomiting on the parents. And I'm like, the parents are really very, very good in comparison to other generations. It seems to me an awful. They're so loving. They're trying so hard. Okay, put it this way: the top marks for effort with the parents. You know what I mean? There's a lot of effort going in, and the results are not reflective in the effort. The effort the parents are putting in is not producing very, very happy children. So this isn't a lack of effort. This is to do with a culture that is presuming that with the right parenting, you can have happy kids, as opposed to the human problem of being in this world leads to angst. And if we're sensitive like I am, and intense like I am, there'll be a lot of it. You know what I mean? That it's this presumption that we could lay all the blame at the parents, I think, was really missing a huge aspect of, we have landed into this earth with parents we didn't choose, in a place we didn't choose. We don't know why we came. We don't know where we're going. And that just fries our brains for the next 80 years, and then we die.
Stella, I hope you will be a motivational speaker traveling the world telling everyone that hopeful message. No, I mean, I think you're right. And, I think the truth is, there are obviously certain parenting approaches that we know are more helpful than others, right? So like in our book, When Kids Say They're Trans, we wrote about Diana Baumrein's very well-researched and replicated study of parenting styles, where a high degree of warmth and a high degree of expectations and boundaries and structure seem to produce overall more resilient, happier, more successful, productive kids. So we're not saying that it's a complete free-for-all, and if you are demeaning and abusive, it's going to produce the exact same outcome as a totally permissive parent who's basically neglectful. I mean, no, there are certain things that we know. But I think the point is, when it kind of comes to this over-treatment question, when parents believe that they don't have the stuff to help their kid through a difficult time, they end up outsourcing their power and their love and their authority and the relationship and these conversations to a professional. And the problem with this is that, as we have seen from Abigail Schreier's book and our own personal experiences and talking to hundreds of families, there's a lot of bad therapy out there. So if all therapists were doing what therapists are supposed to do, we would see a situation where maybe the parent kind of connects with a therapist and they work as sort of collaborators with the adolescent or the child on similar goals. And the therapist just maybe is this person to sometimes reflect to the parent, like, hey, you know, I think this is going on. Maybe you might want to try this, like maybe little modifications. But for the most part, the therapist would be supporting that healthy, kind of properly attached parent in their goals. And like you said before, Stella, sometimes a parent can say something to a child 100 times and it doesn't land, but the therapist says the same exact thing and the kid's like, great, I'm going to do that now, right? So sometimes I think that is an example of what does a good collaboration between a family and a therapist look like when treating a child, right? But we're actually seeing something different, which is therapists have just as much gotten caught up in this idea that kids are fragile, kids are not resilient, kids are all broken, kids need to be handled in a way that capitulates to all of their immediate anxieties and needs. And then you have a recipe for disaster because everybody's relinquished their adult authority and the anxious child is in the driver's seat, right? Jesus. So like something that I have noticed is that doctors' offices and counselors' offices and stuff often now have kind of like standard screening questions around mental health, you know, so like even for adults, like I go to the doctor to get a checkup about my like sinus infection and they're asking, have you been depressed in the last 6 months? Like they're asking mental health questions, you know, I don't know if it's like that in Ireland, but it's like that here. But now when kids are kind of, let's say they're dealing with a pretty normal physical issue or like some sort of academic issue at school, they're asked these questions. And even if there's no legitimate history of serious mental health problems, if a kid says, yeah, I've thought about hurting myself, all of a sudden you have triggered a cascade of interventions, including perhaps calling the parents and telling them your child is at risk of self-harm, making the child get hospitalized, maybe doing some sort of an inpatient or outpatient program where all of a sudden a child is thrust into the world of mental health. You are now a patient. You are now a psychologically unwell patient amongst other kids who are also psychologically unwell to varying degrees. You might be the most healthy kid in your outpatient program, but around you is a bunch of kids with like severe problems. And like that cascade often begins a spiral into worse mental health rather than improvement of mental health.
Yeah, you're hitting on something huge there, because asking people how they're feeling all the time, and you know, Abigail does touch on that and we'll discuss it more when we meet her, but asking them how they are all the time is almost disempowering them of their purpose, if you follow me. If they're in the middle of a purpose and they're trying to do something, it's presuming it's kind of giving them a purpose of happiness, which is a fool's errand when you're a human. You need something that has a bit of depth, a bit of meaning, a bit of purpose, a bit of kind of usefulness. And happiness is a byproduct. While if you're chasing happiness all the time, you kind of get into a hedonism. You're not really going to get to a place that will give you contentment or any kind of lasting contentment or depth. And the additional kind of questions, which are mental health questions, like have you felt low and how is your sleeping, it makes us think, well, no, actually there's certain type of people, and I'm one of them, that if you ask me in any depth, I'll go, well, actually, and I'll find a problem. You know what I mean? There's some of us are just like that. No matter how happy we are, we'll scratch around and we'll find them. And those people probably don't thrive on continuously introspecting about the darker sides of their life. Those kids are arguably better off being kept a little bit busy and don't go always into the depth, because they'll be going there anyway. You know what I mean? So it's not about shaming them. It's not about putting things under the rug. How we've dealt with suicide and suicidal tendencies and suicidal ideation is a very good reflection on how we've lost our way, because we've made suicide this kind of ubiquitous kind of, it's like confetti. It's thrown out as a concept so often that it hasn't got this sacred aura around it, that we are now talking about something devastatingly serious, that everybody has to kind of change their voice around, because actually once you start talking about suicide, it has such a massive repercussion on life that it has to be taken really seriously every time. But if people are asking it at the end of a doctor's appointment about something that, you know, really did not warrant these questions, you're losing the potency and the power of suicide. And then I've found, and I've noticed it with my own teenagers, that suicide is part of the lexicon, if you follow me. It's like, oh, you know, they should just die by suicide, or suicide this, or it's a flippant term, as opposed to there's certain terms in life that should be like taken, that, like I say, have a sacred aura around that we have to respect the awfulness of that, and not use it flippantly, just not use it flippantly.
You know, I remember when I was in training, I think I was working with sexual abuse and domestic violence survivors, and I remember we had a suicide training from like a suicide kind of advocacy group, and they said that you shouldn't be nervous to ask young people about suicide, because I worked with a lot of kids and adolescents there too. They said, don't be worried about asking kids about suicide, because asking them will not give them the idea. And at the time, I remember I heard that and I felt unsure if that was true. The statement was delivered with such confidence that I assumed, well, there must be tons of research about this. But I thought, just kind of like theoretically, philosophically, it's like telling somebody, you know, don't think about an elephant. It's well known in cognitive psychology that if you say don't think about an elephant, the only thing you're thinking about is an elephant in that moment. Like, this is a well-known kind of trick of the brain. Like, we don't have the ability to do that. So when they said asking about suicide won't make them consider suicide, I thought, that's weird. You know, like, why would that be? And it turns out actually that that's not true, because we know that suicide is highly susceptible to contagion. So the more we do hear about suicide, the more we do think about suicide. So that was wrong. So, you know, I'm also raising this because I think the conventional wisdom in a field, especially in like pop culture mental health, the conventional wisdom can be wrong. And the idea that talking about your problems is always helpful, that's conventional wisdom, but it may not be correct. And as we know, a lot of young people that we see have a propensity for rumination and OCD-like fixations. And in fact, in a kid like that, the worst thing you can do is facilitate that ruminative process. So sometimes our conventional wisdom, these throwaway statements like talking about your problems helps, those are not necessarily accurate.
It's so funny you should say all that, because do you remember at the start we were saying that psychologically we often land in a very similar place, me and you, even though we come from such different cultures. I remember I was only about 17. I can kind of date it because I remember who I was talking to, and it was this guy who was telling me he was rejected from being a Samaritan. You know, a Samaritan is those phone lines, you know what I mean? And I said, why were you rejected? And he said, well, I went for an interview. He was a therapist and I was very interested in him. Little did I know I would one day be a therapist, but I just always remember this conversation I had with him. And he said, well, they said to me that for every phone call, I have to ask the person on the others, you know, on the line, whether they're suicidal. And I said, I don't agree with that. That's what the guy said. And I thought, that's so interesting. I remember it always stuck in my mind. He kind of went head to head with the received wisdom. And he said, no, I'm not going to ask every single person on a phone line, are you suicidal?
Wow.
I'm not going to do that. And they said, well, we won't take you if you won't do that. And so he didn't get the job. He didn't take it. And it always stuck in my mind because it very same as you. I thought, I think they're kind of wrong. I don't think it's appropriate to ask every single person on a phone, even if they are ringing in distress. Sometimes it's right, but to make it ubiquitous cheapens it and sticks it in somewhere where it's not appropriate. And this is what I've found with the teenagers I work with, and also with my own teenagers, is suicide is just a normalized option that it should never have become. And therapy is a very normalized option, and medication is a normalized option. This is all from the teenagers I work with. And I'm looking at them going, none of these are normalized options. These are big steps. Going into therapy is a big step. Taking medication is a huge step, and obviously suicide is a whole other thing completely. But that has stunned me, because I've even seen it with, the teenagers would, like, say, my kids would bring back and stuff. They'd say, oh yeah, and my therapist this and my therapist that. And I'm like, wow, it's like it's their pal, their therapist. And they have many of them. And I think they're having, and I've noticed it because a couple of clients I've had have said they've kept conversations for me, rather than I've said, well, what would happen if you bring that to your friends, or if you bring that to your parents? And they think, yeah, well, I wanted to bring it to you because I knew you'd get it. And I'm like, I have now impeded intimacy with the teenager and the parent, and with the teenager and the child. My presence, just only by the fact that they're going to treatment, they are now less close to either their friends or their parents. And that's when that's massive. And that's what I'm realizing. The over-therapized teenager is something we really, you and I and everybody in our industry, really need to. And I know we're coming towards the end, and I think when we go into the exclusive content, we should discuss what parents can do when their child is an over-therapized child, when they've gone to too much treatment. So they've learned to bring it all to therapy and not bring it elsewhere. And I remember one teenager defending this with me and saying, I like to keep the fun stuff for my friends. I just want to bring my problems to you. And I don't want to do it any other way. I just want to keep it funny and laughy with my friends. And I'm like, yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's very tough because, I feel really conflicted about this. On one hand, I think in an ideal situation, therapy is a time-constrained place that is actually quite different from a normal relationship, where we, as the therapist, our exclusive purpose of the relationship is to be a process and a support to another person. We don't have our own needs there. So it does create this special situation where a lot of deep reflection can get done by the client in this kind of special, weird relationship. And ideally, the client will eventually terminate and take that experience of therapy to inform their rest of the way they process things in their life, right? So that's the ideal scenario. And I'm also aware that sometimes, and this is of course true for all of us, the kind of feedback or response that you might be able to get from a friend or a partner or a parent, it's not the same. It's not nearly as attentive or attuned, because the other people have needs too. So it's not a need-free relationship. So I get that sometimes there are things about your life that your therapist will be the most helpful person to talk to. And I am glad to say that when I think about the work with clients, they're not telling me, you're the only person that tells me I'm always right. That's not what they're saying. They're saying, I know that you're going to help me think about it more deeply. Whereas, let's say my parent is only going to think about, like, well, what is this going to mean for graduation next month or whatever? So there are different ways that I think we can offer a very special kind of support. I think the problem is when the presence of a therapist precludes other things. Like when you said that your client has friends, they just want to have more fun with their friends. That's not totally inappropriate. Like I have certain friends that I would never bring my deepest, darkest problems to them.
Me too.
Right? If you don't have any friends and your therapist is your only friend, or if you don't have a relationship with your parents anymore and you are leaning on your therapist to be your parent, that's when I think when we run into problems. And sometimes that's a function of the client making themselves unavailable for those relationships now. But sometimes it is a function of dysfunction in those other relationships. So sometimes, you meet a client and the more you get to know them, you realize, wow, their relationship with their parents is very strained and has been for way before they met me. And the fact that we're here talking is not necessarily because I'm impeding with the parent relationship, right? So it's so complicated. And like, I agree with what you're saying. And sometimes the therapy relationship can be maybe one of the first places where a client really gets to think about things in that caring, nuanced way. And hopefully they can kind of generalize that outside of therapy.
And I think I agree with you. Now, ideally for some people, especially, the therapeutic relationship is their first opportunity to have a safe harbor where they can test being their real self in a place where they're accepted, and perhaps kind of start to it's almost like putting stabilizers on the bike, and then they can start becoming more authentic out in the real world. If we're in a culture where you should talk to your therapist about that, stop talking to me about it, if you follow me, that's the thing I'm getting increasingly uneasy about. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I just noticed it around here. They'd say, bring it to therapy. And I'm like, ooh. It's 100%. Not very nice.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's very dismissive, in fact. It's like, I'm not equipped to deal with your weird effed up problem. Talk to a therapist about that.
I do think that we are in a more individualistic culture, and there is a presumption of don't inflict your burdens on me and I won't inflict them on you. And we will meet in the fun times, and that's the deal. And I think everybody loses. I think your friendships aren't half as good. And I remember, this thing happened and I'd had a coffee with somebody, and anyway, my car broke down, and later on she said, why didn't you ask me to help you? And I just thought, I didn't want to impose. And she said, I would have loved to have the opportunity to help you and become a better friend to you. And I realized we all of us we're pulling back from asking people anything of people. We're becoming more and more individualistic. I won't ask anything of you. You don't ask anything of me. I won't show my vulnerability. You won't show yours. We're getting lonelier and lonelier. And it's a frightening vista. I think we're not islands. We need each other. We need this kindness.
Wow, Stella, that's such a huge point.
Yeah.
Well, let's keep talking about this in the extended conversation. There's a lot more to cover, including, if you are a parent or you're thinking about putting your child in therapy, like what do we need to understand before we do that? And there's just so much here. But that last point you made about refusing to ever be a burden on others directly impedes our relationships and the ability to feel close. I mean, it's when you are in a time of desperation and a friend is really there for you that you bond and you make this connection with them that is going to transcend, oh, we had brunch this past weekend.
Yeah.
It's so huge.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Viva the friendships.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll see you over in the exclusive content.
Yeah.
For anyone on YouTube, please like and subscribe if you enjoy being here in YouTube. We have some amazing comments as well, and we will check you out.
And give us a review.
Substack.
Yeah. Check us out in Substack. Throw us a few stars if you can in a review.
Yeah.
We'll read some of them out soon.
Yeah,
Bye.
for sure. Bye.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, a Wider Lens.
If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
And be sure to visit us on Substack by going to widerlenspod.com. There you can join our listener community, access bonus content and resources, plus learn about additional ways to support the show.
Our discussions are for educational purposes and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.